Well, welcome everybody to our third day here at the Intelligent Vehicle Symposium. We have another exciting keynote presentation that we're going to hear this morning, and it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker. Our speaker is Professor Rob Bertini. He's a professor in environmental and civil engineer at Portland State University, and he's currently doing a sabbatical at Delft University of Technology this year. Now, Rob, as an academic, has had a very unique experience. He's also had a 2-year appointment within the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he served as a political appointee as part of the Research and Innovation Technologies part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So he's had a lot of good experience, and we're going to hear from him today about one of my favorite subjects, which is looking at sustainability and the environment and how that relates to ITS. So, Rob.
Thank you. Yeah. Buenos dias, and thank you very much, Matt, for the kind introduction, and Miguel, Angel, and the whole team for your kind invitation. It's a real honor for me to participate in IV'12 and to have the chance to visit Spain for the first time in my life. So I think my main conclusion about Spain so far is that I have to come back. So this will be hopefully the beginning of more experiences in Spain. And as Matt said this morning, I'm really happy to have the chance to talk about environmental sustainability in a connected world, as I would say. It's a little difficult and challenging to follow the conference dinner from last night, so I'll be trying to look out and make sure that you're all staying awake. And it's also hard to follow the other two keynote speakers who really delivered some exciting videos and exciting materials. I had some things in this presentation about the self-driving car, but those have been removed. It's hard to follow the actual Google presenter that we had earlier this week. But let me just roll right along. And I was thinking about this presentation and where have we come since I really bought my first car in 1990, the Honda Accord that I was really proud of. It was really an intelligent vehicle in some ways. It had an automatic shoulder belt that sort of rolled along the door. And for the students out there, some of you probably were quite young in 1990 or maybe not even born yet. But that was a real smart innovation. It had a single CD player. There was no ABS, no airbags, and it's in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency rates I'm sorry that this is in mileage, but the fuel efficiency rating of that was about 22 miles per gallon. And these days, that doesn't sound very good. Most SUVs, sport utility vehicles, will get about 22 miles to the gallon. What was also happening in 1989 in San Francisco, we had just had a very large earthquake, and so the State Department of Transportation and the transportation community had started to think about intelligent transportation systems, but most of those plans were really put on hold because the challenge at that time was to retrofit the bridges. And interestingly, if those of you who've been to San Francisco, the Oakland Bay Bridge is still under construction now, more than 20 years later. And so we're still kind of recovering and feeling the effects of that earthquake in 1989. Where are we today with intelligent vehicles? And I just pulled some information from Ford's website, and for $20,000 US, you can purchase a 2012 Ford Focus. The highway mileage rating is almost double of my old Honda Accord. And there are a number of intelligent features, not only ABS and airbags. We don't use these intelligent seat belts anymore. But the Ford Focus has a number of intelligent vehicle components, what I might call autonomous intelligent vehicle components, including lane keeping and sign recognition, blind spot information, forward collision, adaptive cruise control, and so on. And many of us in the United States, and especially during my time at the U.S. Department of Transportation, we've been promoting this vision of a connected world, which I'll say more about later. And in addition to the federal government talking about the benefits, we also have the CEO of Ford talking about the future benefits of a connected world. And in the United States, the Insurance Institute, the insurance industry, IIHS is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. They have also come out and said that the features of today's intelligent vehicles can clearly resolve safety issues. Large percentages of crashes can be avoided using these technologies. So we've come a long way, but let me turn for a minute to the broad field of transportation. The transportation system, as you know, is a great enabler, and certainly in the US and in Europe and in Asia, the transportation system is seen as an enabler of economic opportunities, of educational opportunities, of accessibility, really. So transportation, in my view, is not an end in and of itself, but the transportation system that we all benefit from really enables us to go about our lives and pursue our interests, and allows societies to flourish. In the United States, I think we're kind of famous for our interstate highway system that was developed back in the 1950s and 1960s. I know that other countries have used that as a model. And I know that in, for example, China and India, large highway investments are seen as ways to bring economic opportunities to people. But transportation also imposes externalities on society. And the way that we think about those externalities, in some cases, is a little bit, in my view, old-fashioned. But let's just take a quick look at the impacts of transportation on the society, using the US as an example. For example, in 2010, about 32,000 people died on the highways in the United States. And I think many of us view that as being unacceptable. And it's still hard for me to understand how our citizens accept this on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of like a relatively large airplane crash, certainly in the 70s and 80s in the United States, when there was a rash of airplane crashes. Our citizens and our politicians decided that was unacceptable, and we now have an extremely safe aviation system. But on the highway side, we not only accept on a day-to-day basis people's deaths, but also injuries. There are over 2 million people in the United States injured. We don't really have a good sense of the impact of those injuries on our society, both the economy and just on the human lives that are involved. We can estimate in very large dollar values the economic cost of the crashes that occur, but there's really no way to estimate the social cost and kind of the human cost of those. So it's also quite shocking that auto crashes are the leading cause of death in the US for people ages 4 to 34. Now, I mentioned that transportation is an enabler that creates accessibility and allows interactions to occur that we really rely on in our society these days. But in the United States, of course, congestion, as in other countries. I should mention that in countries in Europe, the safety record is quite substantially better on the highways than in the US. But in terms of congestion, we also, every year or two, there's a study that comes out. INRIX is now doing a congestion study. Texas Transportation Institute does a congestion study. And again, these very large amounts, 4.8 billion hours of travel delay. Again, we accept on a day-to-day basis, accept delay. We accept lack of reliability in trips that we're making on the transportation network, and we also can quantify the economic cost of congestion. Now, on a household level, also transportation is our second largest expense in the United States. So turning to the topic of this presentation, sustainability, remembering that safety and congestion or efficiency are certainly related to the environmental impacts of transportation. But let me just say that about 30% of the emissions that are occurring in the United States are attributable to transportation, as well as about 30% of all of the US energy consumption is attributable to transportation. So what I like to say is that, well, we're at least in the transportation field 30% responsible for dealing with this problem, dealing with reducing energy consumption and emissions. In the United States, still today, most transportation energy comes from petroleum. So you could also say that if you look at kind of the global picture, global energy security picture, that we in transportation are also responsible in the U.S. for that issue, the majority of that issue. And you know, whenever there is a crash on a roadway and it blocks a lane, of course that causes congestion, which results in excess emissions and excess fuel consumption. So the idea here is if we can prevent a crash, and so this gets a little difficult because to talk about and take credit for something that doesn't actually happen is very difficult economically, and in trying to convince people that yes, you actually have prevented a crash, and this results in some savings. I'll get to more of that in just a minute. The final point about environmental impacts that I wanted to make is that about half of Americans live in areas that violate federal air quality standards in at least one category. And I think in the United States these days, in some cities, I mean, we do talk about air quality as an issue, but I know in Oregon, where I live, it's kind of a topic that's been swept under the rug, and you don't see the brown haze in the sky like you used to in the 1970s. So a lot of the emissions that are occurring that are causing problems are invisible in the short term, but are having significant health effects in the long term. So this is something that again is not discussed enough. So what do we mean by sustainability? I've at many universities, including mine and including the University of Alcalá, has adopted sustainability as an important theme. And at our university, I've participated over the years in workshops and let's say, conferences and conversations about trying to define sustainability, so we could spend the whole morning trying to define what sustainability means. But I'm of the view that it's up to you for yourselves and for your industry or your community to define sustainability in your own way, because it will be a little different for everyone. But the idea is that we focus, as a civil engineer, we were trained, you know, that everything that we do should be economically viable. But the idea here is to extend that, those economic considerations to social and environmental considerations as well. So we talk about the triple bottom line, that we look at decisions or investments that we want to make, and we not only evaluate them economically, but we also consider social and economic in the evaluation. So I'll describe in a few minutes why some of this can be challenging. In the U.S. and abroad, we've been talking about greenhouse gas emissions for a while, and we've done some analysis, or not we in terms of me, but as a society, we've done some analysis of the kinds of things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this abatement cost curve, if you will, has been a tool that's been used to say, well, we could do some things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that will provide economic benefits, and other things that will impose economic costs. So this is just one example of an abatement potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and two of the things related to transportation on this one that was done a few years ago are fuels and it says cars full hybrid. So this is kind of looking society-wide, and I would say, lack of detail in such an abatement curve for transportation has inspired additional analysis, which I'll also talk a little bit more about in a minute. As one more bit of context, in Europe, the European Commission has released a white paper aiming to, as shown here, cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60%. And then there are 10 specific goals, and then a number of strategies aimed specifically at transportation in order to achieve this goal. So whether or not everyone in Europe buys into this philosophy, this is a European-wide kind of consistent message that's being sent about the changes in the transportation system that have to be made in the future in order to achieve a particular goal. Now, in the United States, we don't have such a coherent vision. And I would just say that many of you are either from the U.S. or have traveled there or understand something about our society, that a lot of things are in the U.S. are done at the state or regional or local levels. And I would just say that we don't have a very clear national climate change policy, and some of you who follow the U.S. politics understand that. But climate action plans have been developed in many, many cities and many, many regions and many states. So this is just a recent map that shows states in the U.S. that have either completed or are working on climate action plans. So in some cases in the United States, transportation decisions are also made at the state and regional and local levels. And even though I'll be talking a little bit in a minute about federal transportation policies, it really is important to remember that a lot of decisions and a lot of actions are taken at lower levels of organization. So when we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, again, people talk about three-legged stools, or this is an example of a four-legged stool approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which basically says you can look at vehicles, you can look at fuels, you can look at reducing the amount of travel, and you can look at improving the efficiency of operations. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I actually found someone talking about a fifth leg to the stool, which I thought I would mention because this was something I had some experience with, where actually the operations of agencies can also be seen as the fifth leg to the stool. And I remember when I joined RITA, the Research and Innovative Technology Administration that Matt mentioned, so I had just moved there from Oregon to the East Coast, and I showed up there on my first day, and I needed to print something. And so I printed something and went down the hall and picked it up, and there was this cover sheet that had the name of the file on it and my name, and then the 3 or 4 pages that I printed were printed single-sided. And I had not seen a single-sided print document in quite a few years. I had never seen a cover sheet, well, maybe many years ago in a batch computer when I was an undergraduate. And so I said to the IT guy, I said, well, we need to get rid of these cover pages and move to two-sided printing. So little did I know, this was my first day, I'm the deputy administrator. He actually took that as a direct order, and he went to his office and changed all the settings for the printers without telling any of the 700 staff of the agency. So within a few hours, I had a really nasty email from one of the employees saying that you took away my cover page, and I need to print a cover page, and I need to print my documents on single side, and So anyway, you can cause turmoil in an agency in an unintended way, as I learned my first day. So we changed it back, and then we went through a process and formed a green team, and then the employees came up with this idea we should get rid of the cover page and go to two-sided printing. So it took about a year, but we had an impact on agency operations. So let me just highlight a few of the things that we're doing in these 4 or 5 different areas. Certainly, many of you are familiar with clean vehicles, and quite a bit of progress has been made globally. In the United States, we talk about CAFE standards, which are the corporate average fuel economy, and I highlighted for you the fuel economy of my 1990 Honda versus the 2012 Ford Focus, and actually we've made huge progress in fuel economy standards in the U.S. Certainly, conventional vehicles are becoming greener. There are more and more alternative fuel vehicles on the market, and lots of pilots and tests going on with electric vehicles and hybrids and plug-in hybrids. Again, from a political perspective, during the George W. Bush administration, the focus was really on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and a lot of federal investment was made in that area, and there's still efforts going on in that area. But the Obama administration in the U.S. has really emphasized electric vehicles, and so this is something. For example, I just pulled this map from the state of Oregon. And there are quite a few hundred charging stations now in the state of Oregon, and actually on the Portland State University campus. I have not seen this yet, but they've installed Electric Avenue, which is a charging infrastructure and kind of pilot test environment for auto manufacturers to bring electric vehicles to the community. And quite a few auto manufacturers have done this. I think the Think vehicles were recently delivered to Portland as part of a pilot, and a number of companies, including Toyota and Nissan, have been working to field test electric vehicles using Oregon as a test bed, among other places. In the areas of fuels, certainly there are many different fuel types available for vehicles, and more vehicles are able to function using different types of fuel. From the standpoint of reducing vehicle miles traveled or vehicle kilometers traveled, there are lots of strategies, not only from the federal level but the state and local level. We try in the United States, public transportation is not always certainly as convenient as it is here in Europe, although we have several large cities that account for most of the public transportation use. But we're trying in the United States to promote public transportation and encourage mode shift. Land use is another tool in our toolbox for reducing distance traveled. Car sharing and bike sharing have been two relatively, I don't want to say simple, but relatively straightforward types of services that are being introduced in more and more communities now. In having spent the last decade or so living in Oregon, a lot of people look to Oregon, to Portland in particular, as a place where public transportation, all kinds of public transportation modes are working, where relatively bold land use regulations are in place in Oregon that don't really exist elsewhere in the United States with an urban growth boundary. So a lot of people look to Oregon as a model, but many other communities are developing policies and programs to reduce the amount of travel. And there are also people in the United States who believe that we've reached peak travel. You've probably heard the term peak oil, but the distance traveled per person has been declining in the last few years. People are looking at trends in younger people who are not obtaining their driver's licenses. I know when I was 16, I wanted my driver's license as soon as possible when I was 16 years old. And young people in the United States are really either delaying or deferring the obtaining a driver's license. And we don't completely understand all the reasons for this, but the kind of the stereotype is that younger people prefer urban living and are biking and using public transportation and are really deferring this, what I used to think of as an American dream of getting your license and your car and getting out there on the open road. So I think there are shifts that are occurring in our society. In the United States, of course, fuel prices are lower than they are in Europe because our tax structure is different. But on a kind of a dollar real daily cost basis, gasoline prices have gone up, and so perhaps younger people are saying, well, we're going to use other forms of transportation and also other forms of interaction with other humans, as you've probably observed through social networking and texting and so on. Any of you observed that with younger people? No? Yes, okay. So another thing, there are certainly operational things that are going on in the transportation community. Eco-driving is something that people talk about. It actually, there are courses you can take to become an eco-driver. I know people who have who have a Toyota Prius, and they kind of play a game with their car trying to be as efficient as possible using the driver interface in the vehicle. Fiat also has a system available where you can stick a USB drive in the vehicle, and it collects data about your driving, and then you take it to your desktop and plug it in, and you get a report, and you get some coaching through looking at your actual driving versus the most efficient driving that you can do. There are many other things in intelligent transportation systems and managing transportation corridors using real-time data that are going on. And I'm sure if you attend the ITSC later this year, that a lot of the latest work will be presented there. Now, I've kind of talked about these different legs of the stool, and a lot of these things are occurring separately. One approach is to keep pursuing all these separate technologies, all these separate kinds of activities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce energy consumption. But what we don't really understand well, and this is one of my charges to you as researchers, is to figure out what are the effects of the interactions of multiple strategies. And so one attempt in the United States a few years ago to look at the interactions of different strategies toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions was a report that was done called Moving Cooler. And for those of you who don't know about Moving Cooler, it's a pretty interesting study that was done. It was in a way controversial at the time, and some of the participants in funding the study pulled out and so on. But basically, in my view, it was an attempt to see, well, what would happen if you added up all the things that we know or we think we know we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, in the U.S., we don't have a clear national target, but let's say we wanted to reduce emissions in the future. I mean, what's the range of possibilities? And the way I looked at this was, for the first time, it was an attempt at a national level to kind of turn the knobs on all the different policy or push the levers, the policy levers, and see what we could do. So, of course, a lot of assumptions had to be made about growth in travel, growth in transit use, growth in fuel prices, as is indicated here. Also, assumptions had to be made about growth in fuel economy and about innovations in fuel and so on. And this just shows sort of what the baseline was for this particular study. And I'm just going to talk for a second about some of the things. I mean, what they looked at individual actions, many of the types of actions that I've just mentioned, and found that really individually they all would have a very small impact on greenhouse gas emissions for the U.S., from less than 1% to just a few percent. So as part of this study, what they developed was a bunch of bundles of strategies, including pricing, including pay-as-you-drive insurance, including land use and smart growth strategies, improving public transportation, operations in ITS, and so on, as well as changes in how we move freight in the U.S. Those of you who know a little bit about the U.S. know that much of our freight moves by truck. So this just shows that the impact, the future forecast of potential impact, show that the individual strategies could achieve no more than 4% reduction by 2050. When you added up these different bundles, the ranges of the impacts that you could have would be from 4 to 18%, and that included some pretty aggressive assumptions. But really, the most that they could achieve with all these possible strategies was about 25%. Now, this became quite controversial because the study came out at the beginning of the Obama administration, and there was a moment at the beginning of the Obama administration when we were trying to think about, well, what will be our future transportation funding strategy? And the notion of tolling or pricing has been talked about in transportation circles for well, decades, centuries or so even. But at the beginning of the Obama administration, the president had to kind of say, well, we're not going to consider a economy-wide pricing strategy for transportation and I guess that was as a matter of political survival. So by the time I got to the US DOT, we weren't really allowed to talk about pricing or to talk about tolling too much publicly. So this study came out right at the beginning, and it was saying, well, the only way you're going to be able to achieve greenhouse gas emissions targets is to have carbon-based pricing, to have distance traveled fees, pay-as-you-drive insurance. And so, again, this was just not, the timing, political timing of this was somewhat unfortunate, and at the federal level, the US DOT was not really able to fully embrace the results of this study. But this does show you that once you start putting packages of strategies together, that you can start achieving things. Now, As Matt mentioned, I've been spending this year in the Netherlands, and some of you may know that at various times over the last 10 years or so, in the Netherlands, they've been considering a nationwide pricing strategy, and many of us in the U.S. were quite excited about that idea because it would be a real trial, a wide deployment of pricing, and we could really see, well, does this really apply? Would this work in the U.S.? And unfortunately, for political reasons in the Netherlands, this kind of project was not implemented yet. But I had this experience last weekend in the north of the Netherlands. I was on a biking trip, and this photo here on the left shows an innovative pricing strategy. This boat was traveling past a lift bridge, and as a means of paying for the bridge to be lifted, the boat owner, it's a little hard to see, would place the toll in a wooden shoe. Many of you know about wooden shoes from Holland, perhaps. And then the guy had a fishing pole, and he would pull up the wooden shoe back into the booth. So this is a real example of innovative pricing strategies for transportation just from a week ago. So Matt mentioned that I had an opportunity to serve in the U.S. Department of Transportation as a political appointee, and I did have a wonderful opportunity to work with Secretary Ray LaHood, and I just thought I would briefly mention a little bit about the U.S. DOT and what, at the federal level, when I was there, we were doing related to sustainability and transportation, and also what is continuing. I read a book before I started in government, and they basically said, you don't have much time. When you join a government agency as a political appointee, you've got to really have a couple things that you want to achieve. And so I did establish for myself 3 priorities, and one of them was trying to raise the focus on sustainability at the Research and Innovative Technology Administration, as well as workforce development, and as well as improving collaboration. And so those were some of the things that I was working on. Interestingly, the Secretary, early in his tenure at the DOT, established 5 priorities, the first of which is safety. And for those of you who follow the Secretary, he has a blog, he is into Twitter and Facebook and so on. Safety is the #1 priority at the U.S. DOT these days, and rightly so, in my view. But also the other 4, state of good repair, economic competitiveness, livable communities, and environmental sustainability, I think have been highlighted to perhaps a lesser degree than safety, but I think it's important to recognize that sustainability is linked to safety and to the other categories. And some of the things that the Secretary has said is that sustainability should be a principle reflected in all of our investments in infrastructure. And I think in the U.S., at the federal level, a lot of the policies and a lot of the funding, I guess I would say that the federal level, the 2 levers that they really have are funding and regulation. And for the first time, the U.S. DOT has been encouraging competition among communities using specific performance measures, including sustainability, as a way of receiving funding. So instead of targeting funding only by formula, they've developed some competitive programs. They're called Tiger programs, and sustainability has been that category has been one of the criteria for making funding decisions. I think in the United States, the Secretary talks about livability, which I think is kind of related to sustainability, but a lot of people are not really clear about what livability means. Livability has been a little bit controversial because he made the statement that I show here about if you don't want an automobile, you don't have to have one. But I think what livability means is basically having choices, and whether that's a choice of the transportation mode that you want to use. And basically, for many people in the United States, the only mode available to them has been the automobile. At the federal level also, some dramatic achievements have been made, in my view, related to sustainability, and some of this has come from the President himself, and the President has established as a goal to reduce oil imports by 1/3 by 2025. I think one of the things that a lot of people in the United States don't realize is the significance of the changes in auto fuel efficiency standards. And really, while I was there at the US DOT, the DOT and the Environmental Protection Agency were working with the auto industry to develop quite bold, comparatively bold improvements in auto efficiency standards. For several decades, no changes were made to the fuel efficiency standards in the US, but now, as you can see here, the standard that we're aiming for is over 50 miles per gallon, and this is from the White House, perhaps as you can imagine. But the idea is that they're promoting the idea that consumers will save a lot of money on fuel. And surprisingly, to many of us, the auto industry has been at the table and has embraced this idea. And really, the administration has moved forward on this quite boldly. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about. In addition, many of the technologies that I mentioned before in terms of ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions through system efficiency in the United States, there are a lot of technologies that have been deployed around the country, including surveillance, including traveler information, including electronic toll collection, ramp metering, and so on. And as the deputy administrator at RETA, I was also for 1 year leading the ITS Joint Program Office, and the year that I wasn't leading it, when Shelley Rowe was there, of course the ITS program falls under RETA's umbrella, so we're quite proud of the accomplishments over the last 20 years of the ITS program in getting a lot of ITS technologies out into the communities. The area that I think the ITS program in the United States has not been as strong in is really emphasizing the sustainability, the environmental related impacts and benefits of these technology deployments. As just a little bit about the future vision of the ITS program in the US, as many of you know, the ongoing work that's occurring in the US is emphasizing connected vehicles. And what we tried to emphasize is that the vision for the future is a multimodal surface transportation system with connectivity as its central core. So yes, it's cars, but it's also trucks, it's also fleets of all kinds, it's also public transportation. It's also the humans, the drivers and the operators of those vehicles. It's also the infrastructure. The cooperative systems that we envision include components of the infrastructure. And it's mobile devices as well. So it's not any one of these things, but it's all of these components working together. And the idea is to leverage technology, frankly, much of which already exists, in order to improve safety, efficiency, and the environment. And I think we need to do a better job at conveying the fact that if we do prevent, let's say, 80% of the crashes in the future, if we cut the number of fatalities and injuries and crashes in the United States and globally, that we also have efficiency and environmental benefits that come with that. That's an area, as researchers, that I encourage you to think about and encourage you to develop better ways of communicating. And this slide just shows kind of that future that certainly we'll have vehicles communicating with each other. So there's not only a place for the kinds of autonomous self-driving vehicles that we've heard about the last couple days, but also vehicles that are communicating with each other and with devices and with operators. Some of you may know about the safety pilot that's going on in Michigan now. The University of Michigan is leading a US DOT-funded pilot involving several thousand vehicles, connected vehicles, that will result in a lot of data being available. And one of the things that I hope is still true is that we tried to encourage was that these data will be made available for researchers. Something to keep an eye out for and make sure that we all hold the US DOT accountable to make sure that those of us who are interested in using the data can get access to it. And the main driving force of this safety pilot is to provide information for NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to begin a regulatory decision-making process. And I didn't know much about regulation before I joined the US DOT, but it's a big part of what the DOT does. And there's a very formal process that occurs, a rulemaking process, involves lots of lawyers, and involves lots of interaction with the public and with industry. So this is something for you to keep an eye on, that next year, 2013, when the safety pilot is completed, NHTSA will begin a regulatory process to look at whether to require, basically to require a DSRC radio in all new vehicles, or develop an incentive type program, a safety star type program, to encourage vehicles to be manufactured with those devices. Of course, the safety pilot is not only about embedded technologies in vehicles from the factory, but also about aftermarket devices, and the safety pilot includes 2 tiers of aftermarket devices in the test. I mentioned environmental sustainability as one of my goals at RITA. So one thing we tried to do was push the development in the ITS program of what we called the ARIS program. Some of you may have heard a little bit about it. I know Matt has been involved a little bit in the ARIS program. And the idea of the future that we envision is there will be data coming from a myriad of sources, from the infrastructure, from vehicles, and of course we think naturally about how to use that data to make the system more efficient, to provide traveler information, to provide routing information, to reduce congestion. But the ARIS program is trying to examine or trying to emphasize the examination of how these data could be used to make let's say, eco-friendly or environmentally friendly decisions, and to develop pilot applications of types of applications. And these are some examples on this particular slide of where the ARIS program is headed toward developing some, as I understand it, we have the safety pilot, but then there will be a set of what they're calling regional pilots over the next few years that will include the pilot development of, low emission zone, an eco-integrated corridor management system that involves multimodal management of a corridor, transit, and highway, eco-signal operations, eco-lanes, alternative vehicle fueling support, and eco-traveler information. So if you wanted to be cynical, you could say all they've done is put the word eco in front of everything. And I think we need to be, as a community, we need to be careful that we don't just do that we don't just add eco, or, we call this greenwashing. We don't just change the logo to the color green. I noticed, I was in Barcelona and in Germany, I've seen that McDonald's has a green logo, and I'm not sure exactly what that means. In the US, the logo is red, but so we need to be careful and not just turn our logos green. We need to, in the spirit of the moving cooler study that I talked a little bit about, we need to continue as a community in looking at the interactions between strategies and between technology, between innovations that are occurring at different levels in the vehicle, by the road authorities or the transportation agencies, and by individuals. And I think there are a number of challenges that we could take on as a research community and say, well, if you have one self-driving vehicle, or if you have one eco-driving vehicle, what is the impact on the surrounding vehicles that aren't equipped with those capabilities? Are there ways that a small percentage of intelligent vehicles, self-driving or cooperative vehicles, can influence the rest of the system? And there has been some research in this. I have not done a complete literature review, but I wanted to mention a few of the projects that I've come across recently that have started, I think, correctly down this path. I'll mention Professor Barth has been a pioneer, I think, in the U.S. in this area of identifying the fact that the way vehicles are operated by humans right now is not optimal, that there are ways that at an individual level we can improve the operation of, and in this case on this curve, in some areas we need to actually reduce the speed, and certainly we can look at eco-driving strategies for reducing the speed variability. But I think we need, as a transportation community, to take this research much farther, and there needs to be more support for this kind of research that examines these questions of how a single vehicle or a fleet of vehicles or an entire system operating more efficiently will have impacts on the rest of the system. In Europe, there is the EcoMove project, and I just briefly wanted to, some of the colleagues that I work with in the Netherlands are at TNO are working on this, and they're emphasizing really smart traffic signal urban operations in terms of the EcoMove benefit on the right-hand side is taking basically the wasted fuel consumption and wasted emissions that are occurring and trying to recapture that through smarter interaction between vehicles and traffic signals. And those of us who studied and who teach traffic signal timing and traffic signal optimization, I mean, we're still, in most cases in the United States anyway, we're using very old technology for traffic signals, and there's a lot that we could do to kind of gain efficiencies in our cities by improving traffic signal operations. As one example from the EcoMove project, they compare the trajectories of two vehicles, and basically there are places where you can gain some quite substantial efficiencies. As shown here, if you have smart infrastructure, you can gain quite large percentages in travel time, 15 to 20% gains in travel time, and let's say 10 to 20% reductions in emissions. I was in France recently at IFSTAR, and they're also doing some eco-driving research. I think it would be good if the researchers globally could get together and compare notes on what's happening with eco-driving. As an example of some of their preliminary findings, they find that a roughly 15% gain can be made through sort of simple optimization of acceleration and deceleration in the vehicle. So because I had this political experience, you know, and I teach transportation engineering, and we think about the economic impacts of transportation, you know, the priorities can change due to politics. And so we're very good nowadays with President Obama and Secretary LaHood emphasizing safety. In the Bush administration, we were emphasizing congestion. And I'm just saying, in the future, of course, we want President Obama to be reelected, but perhaps a future president and a future Secretary of Transportation, you know, Matt Barth, might say that the environment is going to be our #1 priority. So I think the challenge for us as researchers, scientists, and so on is to be better about understanding the interactions between these kinds of strategies so that we can fit into the political priorities and be nimble enough to convey the benefits of our technologies in ways that satisfy the particular political goal of the moment. Not that we as researchers should be driven by politics, but I think we need to be able to inform the political leaders about the advantages of our solutions. And I just wanted to say that as a transportation engineer, we're very good at conveying the economic or mobility benefits of transportation improvements. In fact, I have found evidence from about 1830 when railroad location was first being studied, where the savings in travel time was being, for the first time, traded off against construction costs. So we're very good at doing sort of taking an old road and building a new fast road and identifying the mobility benefits. We're not so good because what we usually say is, well, the models for emissions, for noise, and for fuel have to be based on the transportation or travel time savings. So I think also in the area of safety, we're not very good at connecting improvements in safety to the improvements in emissions and fuel and noise and so on. that those connections are weak. So the little picture that I came up with to try to inspire you a little bit was to say, what happens if we are considering all of these goals at the same time? Can we get better at coming up with clearer definition of the trade-offs? So if we make an improvement that improves safety, can we be more convincing about what the environmental and mobility impacts of those improvements will be made? As another example, at the individual routing level, we can make individual decisions if we have a navigation system. We could pick the fastest route or the shortest route. There are tools, more and more tools being developed to develop the most reliable route if you have access to historical information. You may want to pick, this is the Netherlands, so you may want to pick the most scenic route. You could, I know that my friend Martin Fellendorf and Karin Hirschman from Graz are working on, they had a poster here that they're developing the eco-friendly route, and I know that they've deployed some of this in Vienna. You could choose perhaps the most energy or emissions-friendly route. You could even choose, if you wanted to have the least amount of noise impact on your neighbors, you could choose the quietest route, or if you wanted to make sure that you were getting to your destination as safe as possible, you could pick the safest route. So I think we can all conceive of how this works at an individual level, but what do we do at the network level? In the Netherlands, they're really into traffic management at the network level, but how do we make decisions that allow for people to make individual choices among all those possible choices? But how do we as network managers say, if we have a spare the air day where we want to manage the network in a way that reduces emissions? I was in the Netherlands on Queen's Day, and I was trying to get somewhere on the train, and it was just about impossible to get onto the trains. There were a lot of orange people, and there was a lot of beer involved in Queen's Day, so it's a crazy day in the Netherlands. If you have a special event or snow or a sunny day or a regular commute, how do you manage the network taking into account individual decisions that are being made? So I think this is a research challenge for us. I ran across a PhD student at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, Mr. Weismans, and he's using simulation to investigate interactions at the network level between changing objectives, and these little images show choosing to minimize emissions, kind of played off against, on the upper right-hand side, noise. On the left-hand side, the axes are flipped, and it shows that if you reduce travel time, you also reduce emissions. On the right-hand side, if you reduce emissions, you increase noise. On the bottom, it's a little less clear from a simulation perspective what happens with safety, but this shows if you reduce the number of crashes, or if you reduce travel time, you also increase the number of crashes. Sorry. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty in these kinds of trade-offs, and I would say that this is an item for the future research agenda. So as I prepare to close, I would just say, think about a future where we have ubiquitous data coming from vehicles, coming from the network. We have a wealth of data. Think about what the roles are for the public sector and the private sector. We heard from Google. What is the role of national, state, local, regional government in working with self-driving vehicles? We heard that a number of states in the United States are now legalizing the use of self-driving vehicles. What is the timeline for implementing these systems more broadly? From a data perspective, who's going to own the data? Who's going to archive it? Who's going to manage the access to it for research or for other purposes? Will there be access to such data? What is our role as researchers? We need to think about being at the table when decisions are made about data definitions, about where the data are being archived, and so on. I think there's an opportunity in the United States that has not been explored enough to link the electric vehicle and electric utility community to the transportation community. I can share one anecdote that during my time at the US DOT, we visited the Department of Energy. We met with the chief scientist, and they really were not aware of what was happening in the transportation field with respect to wireless communication. They were saying they wanted to develop a protocol and a standard for wireless communication at the short range between vehicles and charging stations, and we said, well, in the US, in Europe, and Japan, there's already spectrum that's been allocated for short range communications in the transportation sector. At least it seemed they weren't aware of it. Perhaps there were people in the Department of Energy who were, but I think there's an opportunity here to collaborate more with the energy community. There are a lot of issues that remain open. Frankly, financing and privacy and cybersecurity, governance, I mentioned data, who's going to own it, and so on. So there's an impressive array of topics for us to take on as researchers. I call this call to action, and some of this I've already mentioned, but I would just say I challenge you to improve the way that we define and quantify and communicate the benefits of our innovations, both in the areas of safety, mobility, and the environment, and develop a much better way at understanding the interactions between those types of benefits. Let's remember the importance of data, not only for our research, but for the ultimate system that gets deployed. I think cooperative deployments involving public and private sectors are useful. More collaboration, as I mentioned, we need to talk to our friends in the Department of Energy, and frankly, the Department of Defense in the U.S. As well. The U.S. Department of Transportation was not really talking to the DARPA people, and I think we were trying to change that. I think personally fleets are the place, perhaps even with trucks in the U.S., where a lot of these deployments will happen first. There are, well, in the transportation community, as researchers, we can't forget about the people who are actually implementing the system. And so we need to remember to talk to the people who actually are responsible on the ground for implementing the technologies that we are envisioning. And in some cases at the roadside. I think from a policy perspective, one of the things that I learned is that the policymakers are frankly open to hearing from us in the academic and research communities. I was, I guess, the only professor at the U.S. Department of Transportation during my time there. Now we're relying on Professor Dan Daly as a visiting scholar at the U.S. DOT. So I think we need more examples of academics joining policymakers and trying to learn how to communicate in a way that they can understand. In terms of sustainability, as I work with my students, I find that the sustainability topic is one that attracts students to transportation. They see, as opposed to, let's say, a 1950s mentality when we were building highways and impacting the environment, they see, as transportation professionals, that they want to make an improvement in the environment, an improvement in society through their work in transportation. So there's been a bit of a flip, and we really try to highlight the positive impacts that transportation can have on the future, and our students seem to thrive on that. So I encourage you to think about the role that sustainability can play in your work as well. I should acknowledge, well, I'm happy if you contact me through my email at Portland State. My colleagues at TU Delft, at Traffic Quest, and at the Dutch National Science Foundation have helped support me during this year. And I would just leave you with one thought from the president of the University of Alcalá 2 nights ago. Just remember that the earth can live without us, but we cannot live without the earth. And with that, I'd be happy to answer a few questions. Thank you very much. I know that the coffee and the poster session are waiting for you outside, but are there any questions? It's coming.
Your talk was very, very illuminating to some extent. But a common line of thought that I found very impressive was that, how to say that, not the last sentence, but one of the sentences before, it is more a community business, the whole theme that you addressed. It's not, individuals have to put their responsibility into it, and all their kind of strengths maybe and efforts, but it's a community business.
Yes.
So if it comes to the point where you don't want a car, you should not need one. That's really a tough task for the future, and it causes a revolution, in particular in the States, I think.
Yeah, what I try to emphasize is, and again, I spent 2 years at a federal agency, and I think the perception is, well, the federal government knows everything and is going to tell everybody what to do, and it applies to the whole country. But I think what we need to do, our community, the research and academic community, we need to provide tools for people to make decisions at various levels, so individuals or neighborhoods or cities or regions or communities, to say, well, and I've used this example when people talk about pricing based on distance traveled. I always say, well, yes, we can do pricing based on distance traveled, and maybe I'm not answering your question, but I forgot to mention this, that you could have pricing based on anything. And if one city wanted to say, hey, we want to price the use of our road, we want to build a cordon like London has done, or Stockholm, I think. But maybe one city wants to only charge people who don't live in the city, right? And they want to make it free for their residents. Or another city wants to charge based on the fuel consumption of your vehicle or on the weight of your vehicle. But I think we can provide tools for anybody to decide what the criteria are. And I guess, maybe to try to answer your question, there are going to be places where people have to have a car or a truck. If you're living out in the middle of, Nebraska, for example, and you own a farm, you need a car or a truck. And but there are places. There are going to be times when that person is going to be traveling in other places where they won't need a car, and so having access to, let's say, a shared car service or a public transportation system that's harmonized in terms of how you pay for it could be to everyone's advantage. So I think you need to not only think about space, but you need to think about time, because people move around a lot. People don't necessarily stay in the same community for their whole life. Certainly people travel for business, people travel for pleasure, and I think matching the transportation solution for the need, for the purpose, is more and more possible now. So, purchasing the sport utility vehicle for the one time in the winter that you go skiing may not be necessary in the future if you have access to a four-wheel drive vehicle when you need it. Did that kind of answer your question?
Oh, it was more a comment than a question, so thanks.
Anyone else?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for your talk. I'm just curious, there's been a strong and quick upswing in interest in automated vehicles, semi-autonomous vehicles, and that kind of thing. From your experience relatively recently in US DOT, how do you think that's viewed? Has it been a surprise? Is it seen as a threat or an opportunity? And can you elaborate on what your sense is sort of going up the political chain from your experience?
Yeah, I left Rita last July, and actually I was mentioning to you, Richard, a couple days ago that I thought it was interesting because when I was a grad student at Berkeley, colleagues there at PATH were finishing up the automated highway system research, and they did the San Diego demo while I was a student there, and then the program kind of ended. And while I was at the US DOT, almost no one mentioned the AHS program. I think all those people are retired or gone, and I'm not really sure why that, whether it was intentionally swept under the rug or just institutional memory is too short. My sense is that it's been a little bit surprising at the upswing in attention, media attention, and sort of, let's say, the average citizen. I mean, I had, I guess it was BBC or Sky News on in the hotel yesterday or last night after the dinner when I was finalizing some of these slides, and they were talking about, you know, Google vehicles on TV and self-driving vehicles, and so this is something that's in the media. You hear about it on the radio. So I don't think that at the US DOT they see it as a threat. I guess I can't speak for them, but I would say that at least when I was there, we were really viewing this as there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, that there's going to be a mix both in time and space of different kinds of vehicles that are hopefully interacting with one another in a cohesive way. And yes, there are vehicles, as I mentioned with my Ford Focus example, that have some pretty intelligent features that are fully autonomous now. The full capabilities of the self-driving vehicle, I think a lot. I guess I would put in a plug and say that the US DOT took a risk back in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, and funded the automated highway system research. And I think at the time there were a lot of critics of that program, but I think it's fascinating now, let's say 20 years later, that this is kind of taking off, and that is a nice idea that government-funded research can then hopefully contribute a little bit to something that becomes fully viable and even a product that has benefits for society later. Those are my thoughts. Okay.
Great. Well, again, thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Very, very nice comments, and we'd like to thank you.
Thanks again.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.